We even before the pandemic, the global economy was already slowing very badly. The pandemic made it worse, and but if you look at the pandemic, or if you look at the Cold War, so-called Second Cold War, Cold War 2.0, it is causing, and also the sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine. All these problems are basically causing supply side problems. Okay, but how does interest rate help to address the supply side problem? It cannot help. Interest rate basically reduces demand. It doesn't address the supply side problem. So we are not going to solve the supply side problem, with this situation. And the other thing I think which is very important for us to recognize is that we have now, in the US, you have full employment because of the policies undertaken by Obama, by Trump, and by Biden. You have full employment. Most of the workers are experiencing income declines, real income declines, but they still have. Yesterday, it was announced that for the first time in modern history, that the real incomes of working people throughout the world, rich countries and poor countries, all shrank during the last few months. Okay, so we are experiencing a world recession, and people are still talking as if it's only going to happen next year. It has already started, and this is a deliberate recession. It is a recession caused by the sanctions, which are basically causing the supply side disruptions. It is a recession also caused by raising interest rates, which are slowing down the economy. That's why I'm looking forward to the debate with our other colleagues who have not yet spoken about these issues. Thank you. Your microphone again, Pak Hidayat.
Still muted.
Yes.
Yeah, if we're talking about this extensively, one day will not be enough, right? Takes a long time. Okay, so
Kalau ini
test. Can anybody hear me? Those who are joining Zoom? Yeah. Test. Okay. Prof. Jean, I would like to greet Prof. Jean Bernard. Can you hear my voice? Oh, perfect.
Yes, I can hear your voice. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Prof. Susan Scruder, can you hear my voice? Prof. Susan?
I can barely hear your voice.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, Pak Hidayat, your microphone is always off,
Yeah, because if we turn it on, it's going to be a feedback here in auditorium, Prof.
Oh, okay.
So that's why. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I would like us to welcome our next speaker for the afternoon, Professor Susan Scruder.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right. And I might just put my video on for you so that you can see that I'm here.
Yeah.
And so I'm here in my office in Sydney, Australia. Thank you for allowing me to speak at your session. It's a privilege to engage with you. And as I'm hearing what people are commenting, on. I'm starting to feel that my presentation might be a little bit too abstract, but yeah. So what have I done in the area for climate change and sustainability recently? I did publish a paper last year on a wealth tax on private gross assets, which could help, thwart sovereign debt crises. And I'm also going to, I should bring up my screen here. And I'm also working with the UN on a multilateral credit rating agency so that we can create a new system for EMDE, sovereign debt assessment, so that it won't they won't be so roiled by economic events and financial events and disruptions and all this. So this piece here, let me see if I can't. I'm just trying to share my screen. All right, let me bring my screen up here. This is the one I want. And right, so I have a tendency to speak really quickly. So do catch me. I'll be looking at the chat. Do catch me if you don't understand something. But so now my mind is being thinking about monetary policy and how monetary policy could be used to help support mitigation or an ecological transition due to climate change. Yeah. And so part of my thinking about this has actually been the pandemic. The pandemic has been a really great teacher because it reminds me that there are different types of inflation. One is demand-driven inflation, and the other one is supply-side disruptions, and that's what we have now with pandemic and going forward with climate change. The pandemic is fairly quick. Well, I should say, shouldn't say quick. It's lasted a while. But climate change is not going to be a quick event. This is going to be a long-term trend, which we need to start thinking about. Central banks are thinking about it, and I've started to think about how to help them. So, so monetary policy today, as you've noted, is it's a bit not helpful for what we're experiencing with supply chain disruption. Right. And this is because monetary policy today isn't oriented for supply chain disruptions or supply side shocks. It's oriented for demand side shocks. All right. Where prices and output move in the same direction. All right. So, for instance, the Great Depression, this was a shock in the financial system, which supposedly caused consumers to pull back on their consumption, their expenditures, due to uncertainty, and that caused businesses to pull back on their investment expenditures because of the uncertainty. So what we saw there was a negative shock, decreases both output, and prices. So you had decline in output and decline in prices or deflation. And so this is what monetary policy today is oriented towards. So monetary policy in this instance is to decrease the interest rate to strengthen demand. And you're going to have the other way around. For time's sake, I'm not going to give you an example there. But the approach supposedly promotes efficient allocation of resources, growth, and hence employment. Stability of prices gives businesses the confidence to invest, right, and increase output and employment. So this is what they're doing today. And this has been this is the neoliberal approach to monetary policy. This has emerged since about 1980. And so I've been thinking about, what's been happening prior to this orientation for central bank policy? So, and can we do something different? So the COVID pandemic has been a great teacher, right? This was a supply side shock. Output dropped, but prices increased. This is something which central banks can't handle. All right. And the Ukraine conflict, of course, as Joma mentioned, the sanctions have made the situation worse through the impact on energy, fertilizer, and foodstuff prices. And I found it really disheartening that central banks have justified managing the situation like a supply demand side problem because the drop in supply gives the appearance of a strong demand. Even though demand may be the same, but because of the drop in supply, central banks are justified as treating the situation as if there were overly strong demand. And so, of course, controlling inflation through policy rates comes at the expense of workers who face rising mortgage costs, all these, all right? And of course, this is not helping the situation for coming up with support for climate change transition. All right. Again, climate change, this is like a pandemic as it acts through a supply side, and impacts prices. However, unlike a pandemic or conflict, climate change is a long run or trend issue. It's not a short-term shock. All right. Now, central banks, what I've been looking at, they're trying to grapple with this. All right. They're trying to figure out how to adjust their system. Yeah. So they're looking at stress tests. They're looking at models, updating models for projections. They're looking at how to adjust this concept of heuristicus, which is sluggish adjustment, for understanding climate change. So they're trying to modify their model for a scenario which is not well suited to that model. Yeah. And I've been looking at the work of Jerry Epstein, who's a monetary policy specialist. And he's been looking at, he argues really quite rightly in his work that supply side sources of inflation are more prevalent than demand side sources of inflation. So central banks have really been they're narrowly focused, is what I'm trying to say, on their model. All right, so revisiting monetary policy. So what did they used to do? And of course, there's a lot of rich history, both from developing countries and from developed countries. All right, so central banks used to act as developmental banks. Yeah, so India and China, for instance, were involved in the planning of development and allocation of medium and long-term credit. All right, and Brazil and South Korea were similar, but not as active. There was recognition that price stability as a path to economic growth was too limited. Right, it's only one facet, right, that central banks could influence. So India, for instance, industries were stimulated by cooperative banks, which were funded by their central bank. Large firms are supported with industrial finance corporations, which the central bank helped to set up. Small firms were supported with the state finance corporation, also influenced by the central bank's developmental role. And China, People's Bank of China, we see state-owned commercial banks, regional banks, state development bank, export-import bank. All of these were developed with the influence of the China central bank. So, and, similarly for developed countries, United States Federal Reserve guided credit through controls, and they were, it was very interested to influence real activity and development. So it provided capital to the development institutions, credit ceilings, preferential interest rates. So look at all the range of things that central banks used to do. And today, what do they do basically is, fiddle around with the policy rates. Yeah. And they adjust the money supply to accommodate the policy rate that they want to hit. Yeah. So, Europe, central banks use of credit control. So lots of range of things that central banks used to do. So I'm thinking, all right, so we need to get back to this somehow. And because the central banks for climate change are really coming up short. They don't know quite what to do. And probably the best central bank to watch for innovations is the Reserve Bank in New Zealand. I used to work in New Zealand years ago, and I would be invited occasionally down to comment on their work. They like to have critical comments on their work. And so I get invited down, and it's a very conservative bank, but they're interested in developing new ideas where they can in order to help their stabilize their economy. It's a very open economy, but yeah, I found that if you watch the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and the publications, you are on the cutting edge of what central bank policy was likely to go. All right. So what I was able to see was a lot of people, conservative economists, would be invited down with the treated very well. No, what I'm trying to say is they're treated very well for their insights, and of course, exchanging ideas, very conservative basis, and also banks. Banks are really quite prominent in those meetings, and so it was really quite interesting to see the pressure that both conservative end of the economic spectrum and banks would put on the central bank in terms of adopting ideas that would suit them. Yeah, so I thought that was really quite interesting. But yeah, keep an eye on. So what I'm looking at today here is, coming from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Last year they put out 3 very good publications. One on stewardship, how they are managing, adapting their system of virtual cash to accommodate central bank digital currencies. What is cash going forward? And then, what is the design of central bank digital currencies? So they did really 3 great publications last year. And so I'm going to draw on some of those insights that help me think. So what are central bank digital currencies? So I'm looking at this as possible. Could these be used to help fund climate change? Yeah, and help to get off that reliance on using the policy rates to manage economic conditions. Yeah. All right. So what are they? They are virtual assets. All right. So get virtual assets stored on electronic ledgers controlled by banks. All right. They make a great distinction between virtual currency and virtual cash. All right. So the system that we see, our electronic transactions that we see, is a system of virtual cash. They're treating central bank digital currencies as assets which are very liquid and can be used as cash. They have a cash-like quality. Yeah. So and the CBDCs, are anchored and convertible to the country's currency. Yeah, it's not quite the cash, but it can be treated as cash. So I'm trying to work out the ramifications of this. So CBDCs differ from virtual cash, but are so liquid they have cash-like quality, so they can be used for transactions. All right, so they saw this in the private sector, and they felt threatened by it. It wasn't just the RBNZ, but other central banks as well, because if people use this cryptocurrency widely, it disrupts their ability to manage the monetary policy. So this is why a lot of central banks are delving into this. So central banks are adjusting their systems of virtual cash to accommodate this virtual asset or virtual currency. So the idea is that individuals can hold accounts at the central bank. It's thought to allow disadvantaged individuals to enter the financial system. All right. So it's not just individuals, people, workers. It's also firms. All right. So the central bank could be in a position to lend for projects. They could lend to the government. They could lend to firms. They could lend to individuals. All right. All right. So what's the structure? How would it work? All right. So there are basically 3 designs coming through the RBNZ. First thing that I noticed, which they didn't say explicitly, but I noticed this, is that central bank digital currencies are liabilities on their balance sheets. All right. Now, the RBA, Reserve Bank of Australia, a few years ago had a terrific pushback on modern money theory, which is the idea that if the government needs money, just print it. Yeah. And the RBA had a terrific response for that, saying we can't just print money because it's a liability on our balance sheet. CBDCs are going to be the same way, I think. So the first design, central bank allows individuals and firms to have an account with it, in which they can hold this virtual currency. And the central bank engages directly with account holders. That's a big service role, right? That's a big role that they're taking on. All right. You have all these individuals, they have accounts, you have to manage them, and you have to interact with them. That's a lot of manpower. So the second design is that central bank allocates this virtual currency to financial intermediaries, commercial banks, who create and manage accounts for individuals and firms. And it's the intermediaries who engage with the account holders. The third design is that central bank allocates the currency to back-end intermediaries. So these are people who would accept the digital currencies and act like banks, although they're not recognized as banks in the system, right? And so they pass on the digital currencies to front-end service providers to create and manage the accounts. So there's an additional step here. All right. So those are the 3 possible designs. Personally, I like the first one better, but it's going to come at a huge cost. All right. Because they need the manpower to engage with those account holders. All right. So CBDC is potential tool for developmental monetary policy. There is a lot of potential here. There is potential for the central banks to return to a developmental role. They could issue the virtual currency. They could directly target real variables instead of targeting inflation. All right. So targeting inflation, the idea is that the real variables will adjust indirectly. We hope that they will adjust. Yeah. Right. CBDC could be lent for particular projects. Yeah. Projects for climate change, fund a network of community banks, social housing, and so on. So there's potential here. All right. And it could do so at concessionary terms, such as low rates of interest. Yeah. Challenges for it. What would stand in its way? What stands in its way, I think, is it puts a central bank at risk. Coming back to that MMT issue that the RBA caught. The CBDs are a liability for it and weaken its balance sheet. All right. So you put the central banks at risk. Yeah. And so you need to have a mechanism to replenish the central bank's asset side of the balance sheet. If push comes to shove, if it needs to be protected, you need to recapitalize it. You need to have some sort of injection of cash. So the central banks need to be able to recall that virtual currency. So in a way, it's acting like a bond. Yeah, in that sense. So it shifts from going from a cash to being bond-like. Yeah, and then and then some of the projects aren't necessarily generating the funds to repay the loan of CBDCs. Yeah, so you have that issue as well. So I was thinking maybe the wealth tax that I designed last year would do it, because the wealth tax, if you put a wealth tax on gross private assets, it's really quite small. I calculated for the states, and it's 0.2% of the value of an asset. Okay, so of course you're looking at sort of high-end wealth holders and corporations and banks. Your insurance companies, everybody gets taxed. Their assets gets taxed. It's only by 0.2%. Yeah, that's all you need to sustain the net interest outlays on sovereign debt, and to come up with some funds to help support climate initiatives. Well, here, it would help support or protect the central banks if they want to use CBDCs for their developmental policy with this tool. So I think there's promise for it, but I need to suss out more clearly the ramifications of it. What is the state of play on CBDCs? All right. So if you're interested in countries who are working with CBDCs, the Atlantic Council has got a wonderful tracker. And currently, 11 countries have launched CBDCs. 15 countries are piloting CBDCs. 21 are developing it. 46 are researching it. All right. 10 countries have inactive CBDCs. And 2 countries have canceled their efforts at CBDCs. Right, so countries with inactive or canceled CBDs tend to be small countries who are largely unbanked. All right, so when you think about it, issuing this virtual currency, well, if you don't have a banking system or much of a banking system, you're not going to get very far with it unless you revert to that first design. Yeah. But at this point in time, it's too costly to research, implement, and manage for many small developing countries. Yeah. So, another question is, are they really equitable? Okay. If you have an unbanked system and the central bank doesn't have the means to implement this, is it really equitable for folks in that particular country? And I'm also concerned that the last 2 designs enable financial and back-end intermediaries to exploit the process. Okay, once I start to see the finance community and whether it's officially recognized or something more in the informal banking sector, they're taking fees. They're taking their charges for the transactions. Yeah. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about that. But so this is what I've been thinking about is, possible means for funding climate change projects. Right. So, yeah, that's what I have. for you today. Yeah. All right, so that's it. Thanks very much. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Professor Susan Schroeder, a big round of applause, please.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
You can hear us from here, Professor Susan.
Yep, I can hear you.
Perfect. So, lots of thoughts here after reading and hearing your presentation, but I will just keep it for myself first, and then we'll continue to the next speaker first. I would like to greet Professor Jean. Are you here with us, Professor?
Yes, I'm with you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. So for the next 20 minutes, sir, we'll welcome you to share your material and presentation.
Yeah, okay. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Okay, so my presentation will be much more narrow than the other presentation. And so that's so we start with the motivation. So it's very narrow in the sense that it's a focus on policy, monetary policy decision in the last 2 years, and principally in the US and in Europe for UK. So it's a little bit remote from Indonesia. So I had a look at what was happening for Indonesia on the central bank website. So that was the objective. That is what is very recently happening. So we're over the objective. Then that's the response of the central bank, which is as it is now, with a little bit of positive real interest rate. And there's also this distinction on the website of the Central Bank of Indonesia between non-core inflation, that is higher volatility related to food, part of food, and energy prices. And the statement that monetary policy does not respond to transient inflation spikes, but you may have global oil price hikes, and so on. So in fact, when we look at even the first presentation by Professor Price, I would say with respect to what we observe, so in my country, in France, in Europe, UK, or the US, it seems that Indonesia is in better shape recently. Even there's a shock coming in, but the management of the shock, the fiscal capacity, and the response of the central bank is relatively adapted to what's happening to this shock. Whereas in the case of the US, one may think that they are much more sophisticated, with hundreds of researchers and lots of staff at the Federal Reserve, and as well in central banks in Europe, with so many central banks, so many staff in central banks, that they could do at least the same thing than in Indonesia, but that's not what happened. Okay, and the issue is that, okay, we're dealing with short-run issues, but the worry is that if you react too late, then you tend to have too much inflation, much more than what may happen in Indonesia, and then you may get stuck with a very difficult, sharp response to give, much sharper than you would have to do if you started earlier, and then with a much bigger recession. So that's there's a cost of delaying. So that's the implicit story, which is beyond, and this cost is related to a larger recession that what would have done. So perhaps it's a phase statement, but that's the issue turning around. That's worrying people in Europe, and in the US. And also this has indeed spillovers on the rest of the world, because we know that a big recession in US and in Europe has impact on aggregate demand in the countries such as Indonesia. So the point is really on, so monetary policy may have some scientific component, but they are part of an art, which is what we specify in our discussion there. This art is to guess how persistent could be shocks which are coming from abroad, or even internal shocks. And if you do a wrong guess, that is, you're doing an error in the part of art, in the science and art, then you're making potentially policy mistakes with bigger cost for people. Now we have also to think that we are in a specific context in central banks, that is for a decade at least, if not 2 decades. There have been, well, at least since 2007, but for the Federal Reserve even earlier, they have been very, very friendly. So it was very nice to be in a central bank, because you were accommodating a lot. That is, inflation was below target. Then you expanded a lot the balance sheet of banks. Indeed, so this avoided deep recession during the decade, the last decade following 2008. And so some people complain it increased inequality because there was bubbles on asset prices, but afterward people will certainly very, very much complain if there's a deep recession around the world, such as the one which happened in around 1993, which was leading to a number of sovereign debt issues in developing economies. So that's so we start from something small, but this something small, which is monetary policy errors, could have deep consequences. Okay. And part of this monetary policy error is that central bankers were used to be very, very friendly in the US and Europe. And because they expanded their balance sheet, because inflation was very long below target at 0%, 1%. And so life was cool. Okay. And that's an argument from a paper by Professor Walsh. So Professor Walsh is emeritus, I think. So he has published books on monetary policy, which are not necessarily the most funny or interesting books to read, but anyway. So he has published a working paper for the Central Bank of Japan. And his point is, indeed, it's much easier after the war to say, well, you should have done this because we know what is happening. But before, say, 2 years ago, perhaps he would have said the opposite. So his point is to state that for monetary policy, the persistence of exogenous shocks such as oil prices matter a lot. And that's this part which I mentioned, that the art of guessing how persistent will be some shocks, and which is, in fact, for the Central Bank of Indonesia, this dilemma, that is, we do not respond to transient shocks, but we should respond to shocks which are not transient. Okay. And then Professor Walsh says, well, we should have a conservative view, that is to minimize or to take into account the worst case scenario in our decision, which is indeed seemingly more costly in the short run. So, but then in the medium run, because you react earlier, you avoid a big jump into output following some conservative monetary policy with stagflation. Okay. So our point is there to get back to the literature. So a quote from William Barnett, a quite old economist who worked in the 70s at the Federal Reserve to say, well, we have two distinctions. Just what is written on the Central Bank of Indonesia between core inflation and what is not non-core inflation. And then we could have energy prices at this point that could push the economy into trend inflation in some cases, but not always. Okay, so that's the trouble with the art. That is, you need to guess to which extent energy price will last more than 2 years, and so on. And then you have this framing. So should we focus on headline or core inflation? So very classic questions. And then when we look at the literature, well, the literature is very mild, basically in 9 papers out of 10 until recently, they would have said, well, energy prices, they always change, it's transient. So, and in econometrics, you had very few papers who would emphasize that the Taylor rule should be expanded with oil price, energy prices, in the response of central banks. And for the bunch of people doing theoretical mainstream macro, they just do not understand why you would have to take care with persistence of cost push shock. So, and just to say that now it's very baseline what I will try to expand to explain to you. So I just take one of these mainstream textbooks. So that's something where, in fact, the central bank minimize the variance of inflation, which is pi t, the variance of a policy instrument, which is compacted here to be directly the output gap. So in fact, the output gap is directed by the interest rate. So you could replace output gap by the federal funds rate, for example, or the funds rate. Then you have a transmission mechanism, which is a Phillips curve. They call it New Keynesian because, in fact, the sign is not the one that you would have expected with the Keynesian accelerationist Phillips curve, but this sign is, in fact, forcing stagflation. So after all, we're nearly heading into stagflation. So it's not so absurd. And then we have the shock, which appears there, altering inflation, which is persistent. And usually they say this shock has a unique persistence parameter and does not change over time. It does not vary over time. So this rho is 0.8, for example. Okay, so that's the outcome of this monetary policy. You have the shock, which is 0.8, but after 12 period, it's relatively small, and inflation is very much corrected. And because the cost of changing, the cost of, in fact, having a big recession is assumed to be only 2% of the cost of inflation in this textbook. So that's the mainstream textbook. So then you have a very big response with stagflation. So still inflation, but output gap is negative with a very, very sharp answer to feedback inflation. Okay. And then the literature, just exactly the same thing. Now I just change and add a persistent shock, which is stuck at 1 all the time. Then you may notice that in this case, optimal so inflation is still going back to normal very fast. But then this time, the response of output gap, so the depressive part, is very lengthy, okay? And with very huge recession, but lasting along. And then you notice that that's exactly the same model. So we just change one parameter, and then the narrative is completely different. That is, the narrative is stating, in fact, the policy instrument, which is here, the output gap, is completely stuck to responding to the shock in order to cut off what's happening on inflation. Okay, so then that means that, in fact, even in this textbook, they do not necessarily notice it, but the policy response, the optimal one, respond to what is non-core inflation instead of focusing on only on core inflation, just because the shock is very persistent and has an effect. So that's, and how to explain this? In fact, what I would like to highlight, it's not difficult at all. So you have inflation, which depends on past inflation and on the shock. The shock depends from the rest of the world. So the central bank cannot control what's happening outside his country. And the policy instrument, so it could be output gap or interest rate, has an effect on inflation, but has no effect on non-core inflation, ZT, that would be oil price hikes, gas price hikes, and so on. And then if there's a feedback rule where the policy instrument respond to inflation, core inflation and non-core inflation, then you replace the rule into those things. And if ever B times F are negative, then you will fasten the convergence of inflation back to normal. But also if B times FZ is negative for A positive, then you will reduce the sensitivity of core inflation to non-core inflation. And then you will be able to, even though you cannot change energy price coming from abroad, you have the possibility, by responding in your policy instrument to these price hikes from, say, oil, to cut the correlation between your policy objective, which is core inflation, from what happened. So that's just the underlying mechanism. And the point is to say, if whether you wish to stabilize inflation or stabilize other variables, such as output gap stability, or even variables related to climate change, even if you have exogenous shocks, you can act by bringing down the correlation with one of your policy targets or several of your policy targets. So that's the idea, and that's it. And then the logic is fairly direct. That is, the more persistent is an exogenous shock, which is measured by rho, then the more I would need to shut down the sensitivity of my policy target to this exogenous shock, because else my welfare cost would increase a lot when the shock is with a trend for a long time. Okay. And to achieve this, I need to react with my policy instrument, increasing the sensitivity of, say, the funds rate, for example, on this case study, on the oil price in due time. Okay, so that's the consequences. That is, if so imagine in the US, the persistence of inflation, core inflation was really at 0.6 of autocorrelation coefficient. So in 6 quarters, it's nearly 0. So I do not need to do anything as a central banker in this case. And if the shock of oil price is for 3 years with a trend inflation close to 1, an autocorrelation of 0.99, then I would need to react. And then all the issue is to guess what is the persistence, how long will last the shock. Okay, so that's the point to. And then there's the issue of delay. That is, if I delay too much my decision, so then inflation shifts to 9%, 8%, so which is the case of the US, then I need to react relatively more strongly, because the real weight, for example, in Indonesia, the real weight is, say, 1% from the figures that I showed you. So it's not that much, but now in the US, it's up to 4 or 5% negative real interest rate. So it's a lot. Okay. And then if you really wish to shut down inflation, you have the historical episode by Paul Volcker, where inflation was very, very large. And then you had a very, very sharp response, which ended into a world recession for 3 years with a huge cost all around the world. So to see a small delay of 1 year could have deep consequences. Okay, so that's the full message. And here I just highlight that indeed, in the story that textbook gives, they say, well, there's only one cost push shock with a single persistence, but the point is that you may have shocks or prices which last 1 year, 1 year and a half, and you have other shocks which could last for 3 years, and then you turn to shift into inflation spirals. Okay. So I'm nearly close to the end. Okay. So that's a message about timeliness, and also about how fragile are in fact our decision when we get used for in Europe and the US to have inflation below target, and life was nice for central bankers. And then there was a big change for different reasons. Central bankers did not react in the US and in the ECB, because in the ECB you have various countries with different levels of public debt, which really skyrocketed by plus 40% or more in the last 3 years, with a lot of heterogeneity. So the central bank knows that getting into real interest rates positive will lead to a fragmentation and a breakdown of the union, of the monetary union. And in the other case of the US, that's a really different event, which happened with a really oversized fiscal policy, which boosted a lot inflation, and then a delayed reaction. So a sort of mismatch in the policy mix on a very large scale, which on the top of other issues that were mentioned by the first speaker, such as supply chain triggers and other shocks. But then you have the policy response, which is accentuating the difficulties, whereas in fact the policy response are supposed to stabilize. So that's part of the story. So so you have a part which is science, you have a part which is an art, and when you're in the art part, you have some chances to do policy errors. So that's the overall message. So I think I have a question. Yes. So thanks a lot for listening to me.
Thank you so much. A big warm of applause from Jean. Thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation. So we already hear from the fourth of our speaker, ladies and gentlemen. Now I would like to open the question and answer session. For those of you who have any questions or perhaps some thought to discuss with our speakers, you're welcome to raise your hand here. Those who are attending, or raising your hand, the one who's already. Yes, Mr. Aswin. Oh, please, sir, you are welcome to share your thought and your question to our speakers.
Yes. Can you hear my voice?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I have two questions I want to address to Dr. Skruder and also Dr. Jean Bernard. If you are talking about stagflation and the strengthening of a US dollar due to the hiking of the Fed interest rate and high inflation, many developing countries try to release themselves from using the US dollar. And according to Danny Roderick, the economist from the Harvard University, he said that the policymakers in developing countries should reject or turn down the globalization of a cooperation in financing scheme. Because based on his research, the cross-border flow of private sector funds is not propelling or boosting up the sustainable economic growth. So it is also because the benefit or merit of financial globalization, if any, it's too huge, it's too small to balancing the cost of capital fight, for example, and also to balancing the loss of the domestic policy control by the policymakers. So it's kind of a global financing trap. So I want to know what is your observation on this matter. And my second question is, let's say now let us talk about the global debt crisis, which is also affecting the international sustainability growth. Most developing country is in compulsory condition to borrow in US dollar, in euro, but their US dollar reserve is not sufficient. And to buy import goods, for example, oil, machineries, as the price of oil is hiking and fluctuating. And as that crisis approaching, it may escalate to political upheaval, for example, as we see in Sri Lanka, right? So I think US and also the European Union should slow down the hiking of this interest rate, so that will inhibit the global economic growth. I think that because it is not clear until now whether the hiking of interest rate is really overcoming the or settling the domestic inflation in their countries. So it's not sure actually. And also that if we take a look at China, for example, China should be more transparent, I think, in negotiating their debts with other countries. The effort will reduce I say that the uncertainty in the global market, and also more creditor will coordinate with China, for example. And I also agree with Zhang saying that I think the US is a little bit slow in increasing the interest rate. I mean, the US is having a slow response, for example. In my opinion, it should be done previous year in 2021, so they could tackle the increase in inflation rate, the inflation today. Because now I think it's a little bit too late for the US, but it's better late than never, of course. So I think that is my two questions. I want to get some comment from Dr. Scruder and also from Professor Jean Bernard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aswin. Your voice here is a bit down, so we can hear it quite clearly. I hope Professor Jean can hear it clearly, the question.
If not, I can repeat my question if not, you cannot hear.
Prof. Scruder, can you hear the question clearly?
I didn't quite catch it, but it sounds like he's referring to a comment made by Danny Roderick maybe a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, Danny Roderick also. I read the project syndicate mentioning about that. Yeah, according to him, it's useless to have coordination and also agreement, international financial agreement, things like that. So what is your take on this?
Yeah, so I'm quickly trying to look on Google to see what he said. It seems like he said a couple of different things. It's there needs to be more coordination, I think, between regions. I suspect that we're probably not looking at global cooperation as much as regional cooperation, and then trying to garner cooperation between the regions. So it's I've been reading some of the work of Prebish recently, and there's emphasis on regional cooperation in order to confront some of the challenges with the United States and the EU. So it's that's where I think the sort of where it's going to go is looking at the trying to get a sense of the regions and how they can work together to better their area. So I'm afraid I don't probably haven't answered your question, but would my colleagues have a sense of response to that?
Please, Professor John. Thoughts?
Yes. Okay. So I'm sorry, I haven't read this note on Project Syndicate by Danny Roderick, although usually I share many of his views. So, I would say so. There's, it's about the interaction, if I understood part of your question, between what is doing the US in terms of, say, monetary policy and the consequences for emerging economies with respect to potential sovereign crisis or sovereign debt crisis or public debt crisis with capital flight. So, and then one of the arguments is, indeed, it all depends on the transmission mechanism. Some countries maybe more prone to or more sensitive to this, and also a potential regional cooperation that could isolate or dampen the transmission mechanism from, say, U.S. monetary policy to regional areas, knowing indeed that these regional areas also faces other shocks, and which are world shocks related to post-COVID and oil price. So in this, well, I mean, anything which could alleviate the risk of debt crisis with capital flight, sudden stops, and this, if it goes through regional cooperation, is potentially good. So, but it's a little bit short as a question, as an answer.
Okay, I agree with you, Jim.
Thank you very much for the thought and insight, Professor Struder and Professor John. Thank you so much, Mr. Aswin, for the questions and the discussion. So any of you amongst the participants here joining us in the auditorium, if you have any questions or thoughts for our discussion, you are welcome to just raise your hand and then please.
I have one more question, if possible.
Oh, you have one more question, please.
Yes, still with Zhang and also with Struder. Later on also, I want to ask to Professor Jomo also. Yes, I have a question. One of the solutions to curb this stagflation is by restraining the fiscal space or reducing the government expenditure, right? Of course, government should put priority to support the most vulnerable to cope with soaring food and energy bills to cover the cost, but government should also avoid adding to aggregate demand that increase inflation. In many advanced and emerging economies, fiscal restraint can lower inflation while restraining debt. So we could use two strategies to restrain inflation. First, by solely to have tight monetary policy to cooling down the overheated economy, whereas the second strategy is by having the fiscal consolidation. Both strategies reduce inflation, right? Higher interest rate and lower growth will cause increasing amount of debt, but the appreciation of currency will attract investors, whereas the restraining of fiscal will cooling down the aggregate demand without increasing interest rate. So that the cost of public debt will, of course, will decrease, right? So what is your views on this matter, Zhang, and also as Dr. Struder?
Thanks again, Mr. Aswin, for the questions and discussion, for the discussion. We welcome Professor John and Professor Struder and Professor Jomo to also join the discussion and regarding the thoughts that Mr. Aswin already shared with us. Professor Prasetyo Toko, perhaps? Oh, Prof. John, you looks that you are ready to give some of your thought. Please, Professor John.
Not really. So, Aswin, could you just restate a little bit the first part of your question? So,
okay. One of the solutions to curb the stagflation is by restraining the fiscal space or reducing the expenditure.
That's fine. That's right. Yeah. So did we? That's a general view, a general issue with central banking, which was also highlighted by Susan Fodder. That is, if we have a single instrument which is something horizontal for everybody, even several countries in the euro area, well, it does not fit to the demand of the various persons. So I would give an example of what is done in my country for that is. So monetary policy is used, say, to have the single interest rate having an effect on what you expect with respect to aggregate demand. But because in some industries and some households are mostly hit by, say, energy prices, so the government capped the price of energy through in other type of subsidies or whatever. So the government is just limiting the price of gas and so on to households, or even targeting some group of households and firms in order to limit the transmission of of say oil prices increases to poor people budget difficulties and this kind of thing. So that is, you could use the fiscal policy to target specific individuals. And I think the CBDC presentation by Susan was, in fact, there's a great interest of this, but it's also inflating a lot what is doing a central bank, because it's just doing the allocation of capital and potentially taking part of the private sector, private banking activities through lending by CBDCs, is that you could target specific industries, specific individuals, and usually it's fiscal policy which is doing this. But if you take this by, say, on the liability side of the central banks, that could be also another way to target specific individuals through means of finance and so on. So you have this mixture that is, for sure, if you have a single instrument which is at the aggregate level, at a country level, it have an aggregate effect, but we know that there's lots of heterogeneity for people who are targeted, who are facing a shock, in particular the very poor, using a lot, for example, for their work, I don't know, agriculture or whatever. They need to use energy for oil price or oil or whatever, so they need to be protected at the individual level. So that's heterogeneity versus macro level policies. So that you need a policy mix for this.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you
we
so
need
much,
policy mix.
Professor John. Perhaps Professor Susan Scruder, you might
just sort of,
have a thought?
sort of thinking about, what's actually the source of the increase in power. Yes, we do have the sanctions, but we also have a lot of corporate power, which it sounds like they're using that power to make some money right now, the profitability of the energy enterprises. So it seems to be some sort of confrontation which needs to happen, which is not happening. So it's whose problem is that? Is that the national government? Is that the central bank? I don't think that's the central bank, perhaps. It's probably more of the national government, which needs to step up and do something about gouging consumers on high energy prices. But we see some of it here in Australia, but not to the extent that I think Europe or particularly the UK is seeing it right now. But so I wonder if it's more like an industrial policy rather than a fiscal or a monetary policy. So that's something which needs to be thought about too, is there's been this implicit industrial policy for the last 30, 40 years where you release regulations and you weaken oversight in particular economic activities, and in order to help enhance the firm's profit, and that's implicit, allowing the firms to decide how to develop their context and make their profit, and so what's best for society is not what's most profitable. So you need to have some sort of industrial policy reintroduced, and I think Stiglitz has tried to do something with industrial policy, but it seems like the emphasis on his industrial policy is to try to make workers more productive. That's the solution. I don't think that's the solution to something like this. You need to have industries. So we're coming. It's definitely an interesting moment. It's definitely a reckoning right now. We've hit the wall on climate, and what do? My students are terrified. I mean, people who are academics here are realizing that young folk, are really scared, and so it's trying to show them that I'm trying to do my best to help them and try to push a path for them that they can follow through. But yeah, so the stimulation that I get from this stuff is coming from their frustration, being a different generation than I am, is you have to do something to help us. You just can't leave us holding the bag. So that's sort of given me a prod to do some of the things that I've been doing lately. So, but yeah, I'm sure, I don't think I've answered your question, but I think it might be more of an industrial policy issue than the fiscal, although I think maybe the fiscal policy could whack a tax on corporations if there was the will for it.
Okay.
Channel some of the money back. But
Thank you so much, Professor Scruder, for your thought and insight
Yeah, sure.
regarding the question that Mr. Aswin already shared with us. I would like to also invite Professor Jomo to join in the discussion. So could you share your thought and insight, Professor Jomo, regarding what Mr. Aswin already discussed with Professor Jean and Professor Scruder?
Thank you very much. Before I try to address Pa Aswin's question, allow me to pose a question for Professor Schroeder. I think she has made a very interesting proposal, but it's not clear to me why the objections to MMT would not apply to digital currencies, central bank issued digital currencies. As you correctly pointed out, digital currencies are near currencies, and they would have some of the same effects. I can think of some reasons why not, but I'd like to hear your reason, because you are making a very important proposal. The other thing which your presentation reminded me of is the origins of this 2% inflation target. 2% inflation target came from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand more than 30 years ago. It was simply plucked out of thin air. There is no empirical or theoretical basis for the 2% target. And yet it has become the basis for the kinds of rules Professor Chatelain was referring to. I mean, the kinds of, you have this 2% inflation target, you have this deification of central bank independence and so on and so forth, which is proving to be very problematic. Because central bank independence hardly means independence of the central banks. It basically means the subservience of monetary policy to the powers to finance, to financial power, and this of course has been problematic. But I think the recent experience, we find that Asia has done something slightly different. Kuroda, the Bank of Japan governor, has not raised interest rates. Although the yen has gone south, which perhaps he wanted to restore the competitiveness of Japanese exports. I don't know, but this may well be one of the considerations as far as Japan is concerned. But I think it's important to remember that both Indonesia as well as the Philippines during the pandemic, they actually resorted to monetary financing of the deficit. And this is, I think, very bold. I think the way they did it was slightly different. I can't remember who did what, whether it was a temporary suspension, whether it went to the legislature, and so on and so forth. But it's very interesting that people are beginning to challenge these kinds of rules, albeit in very indirect ways. But I think the frontal attack on these rules will only come from the rich countries. If the rich countries don't have this frontal attack, and I think it really is for the US to lead this attack, because the US still doesn't have central bank independence. Although, in the mandate of the central bank, it doesn't have a central bank independence. It has a dual mandate. And the dual mandate is very different from almost all other central banks, because the dual mandate is to ensure financial stability, not just price stability, and also to ensure full employment, which I think Professor Schroeder's proposal suggests that developing country central banks should have a dual mandate, a mandate to support the development effort. And this I think is extremely important suggestion, which is being made. But going back to Professor Aswin's point, I think we have a real problem of stagflation. Yeah. We have a real problem because you have all the forces of economic stagnation are basically being accentuated by this shadow play of pretending to address inflation, because inflation outside of perhaps the US and a few other economies in the world where you have full employment, elsewhere in the world where you don't have full employment, including in Europe, it basically requires increased welfare funding. So you are not addressing the problem. And the US is peculiar because of this dual mandate. And then you have full employment, but of people being kept in jobs, thanks to Obama and Trump and Biden. They're kept in jobs, but they were lousy jobs. Hence the so-called Great Resignation. People resigning from their jobs in the hope of improving their working conditions, improving their lot, and so on. So, but when you have the US attempting to solve a problem which is projected and presented as a world problem, the consequences are very dire. As Professor Schroeder hinted earlier, when Volcker killed inflation in the early 1980s, what he did was to ensure a decade of a lost decade for Latin America and a lost quarter century for Africa. We in Asia was spared for a variety of reasons, including the fact that we were not considered to be good credit risk for Western banks, and so we were not in a position to borrow, except in the case of Korea. But for the rest of Asia, we did not borrow as heavily as Latin America and Africa. So I think we have a situation, as Professor Chatelain was hinting, of a great deal of heterogeneity. And you have a one-size-fits-all type of supposed solutions, which are suddenly going to make the problem even worse, precisely because the same conditions do not obtain in the rest of the world, even in Europe. And that's why I think this is the time when people should stop. At the last annual meetings of the IMF, the IMFC. There was nothing actually said about this. There was no debate on this. When Jerome Powell was sitting in the room, nobody challenged him, on this. And the result is that we are going to live with the kind of inflation which Pa Ashwin was describing, and worse still, the purported solution is actually the problem. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I agree entirely with that. And so this is one of the things that I'm looking at next is MMT versus CBDCs. And it's interesting. I was thinking earlier today that it's like with MMT, what you have is it's an extension of Keynes, and where Keynes is saying, well, we have money in the system and people can hold it as an asset. Okay. And then what we have is the CBDCs is that we have an asset which can act as money. We have, completely the flip. So it's conceptually, it's a challenge. And so I need to look at MMT, and the ramifications are what they are for central bank policy. The RBA, there's a strong contingent of MMT folk here in Australia, and they've had some comments in public in the media, to the extent that the head of the RBA came out and said, "Well, look," he says, "if we do this, what you want, and print this money, there's going to be a liability for us, and we can't have this liability stay on our balance sheets. We have to reverse that at some point. Otherwise, we're liable for collapse." And so he says, you can either bring that money back, or we have to raise taxes to recapitalize the central bank. And so that was his rebuttal of MMT. So I've been thinking about that. Would that be the same thing for the central bank digital currencies? Would they have to come back, in a sense, acting like a bond, or would you have to raise taxes to recapitalize the central bank? So, but what I'd like to see is the central banks act like they used to be, is, be more equitable, promote a more equitable society rather than promote efficiency. If it comes down to equity versus efficiency, then it's, I'd rather see it sacrifice some efficiency for equity. So that's, yeah. The only thing with that argument is that a lot of mainstream economists would say, well, look, our framework is equitable. So long as people are, remunerated for their productivity, well, then everything's equitable. Well, doesn't happen on the ground. So it's a framework which I don't think has been, it's been challenged, but, more conventional economists don't take those challenges very seriously, it seems. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think I've answered your question, but yeah, so I'm thinking about that MMT versus CBDCs. What's the difference?
Thank you so much, Professor Schröder, for the insight, the answer. Prof. Jomo, it might be quite difficult if you wanted to address all of these questions and discussion, because then the digital currency that earlier Professor Schröder already present to us, is it, as Prof. Jean and Mr. Aswin said, will it be a new solution or a new problem regarding the climate, for example, or in the sustainability development in general? So I think it's quite intriguing, but I would like us to continue the discussion, but unfortunately, professors, I'm being reminded that our discussion session's already ended. So thank you so much for the thought, the insight that you are willing to share with us this particular session regarding the sustainability development and the climate, the stagflation and the climate. So Mr. Aswin Rifai, I would also like to convey my gratitude for opening the discussion regarding this particular topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Actually, I have more questions, but later on.
Okay.
Next session.
We can continue it in another forum, perhaps. Thank you so much, Mr. Aswin, Professor Jomo, Professor Schröder, and Professor Jean. Thank you again.
Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sir, madam, before we close the session, I would very much like to invite each and every one of you to share your closing statement regarding today's session in particular. Prof. Jomo, please.
Oh, I'm not sure whether I should try to say something about what I presented or what we discussed. I think the latter is more interesting and perhaps more directly relevant, but I have to emphasize that the problem of climate finance is a great hoax. The carbon taxation is not the solution. All the major slogans are false solutions. I mean, if you think about net zero and so on and so forth, we are basically condemning a lot of people who are already in very bad situations to a worse situation. And it is very difficult to fully predict and anticipate many of the extreme weather situations and the amount of heat stress and people in the tropical zone where most of the people in the world live, tropical and subtropical zone, are going to be in very, very bad shape. And I really don't know what to do. But I think it is very important for the international community and particularly in places like Indonesia to be very, very wary of people who are offering false solutions. I would say the same thing is also true about the stagflation problem, which Professor Aswin reminded us of. Who is creating this stagflation problem? Yeah. Of course, we know that there was a pandemic, which I'm not going to suggest that it was created in a laboratory or anything like that. But even if you leave aside that issue, the fact of the matter is that due to the reluctance to share the technology to relieve the condition of the vast majority of the people, because the technology was available, as we know, but the apparent compromise in the WTO TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights agreement, which the late Nelson Mandela fought for, and which it seemed as if it was conceded in 2001 to revive the WTO negotiations after the Seattle walkout by African countries. That so-called public health exception has not been honored. The spirit of that public health exception is not honored, and I appreciate the fact that President Biden initially refused to join into the strengthening of the defending the rights of the vaccine makers. But unfortunately, he capitulated. And we also have a situation where we have international tax cooperation determined by the OECD, which is not going to help at all to address global inequalities. I want to emphasize once again that, as Branko Milanovic and others have shown, 2/3 of global inequalities are due to international inequalities. Yep. Only 1/3 is due to intranational inequalities. So when you consider that simple factoid, then we have a big problem, because you can address the problems of intranational inequality without addressing international inequality, which actually is going from bad to worse, as everybody knows. So I hope this is of some use, and maybe I hope our debate today has been useful to our audience, and and I wish Jessica all the best after 2 years, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jomo. Next, I would like Professor Susan Schroeder to please share your closing statement.
All right. I didn't have a closing statement prepared, but excuse me. I do want to thank you for the opportunity to engage with your session, and was really pleased to see the level of discussion that I've had, and some stimulating ideas about the directions that I could take. It's always nice to make new friends and see new faces. And I don't get to experience Asian countries too much. I'm usually flying back between the States or the UK. And I'd like to have a visit at some point to you folks. And hopefully that'll take place when the pandemic settles down a bit more. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You are welcome to come and visit us in Indonesia, in Jakarta particularly, Professor, in the next future.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we would like to invite Professor Jean to please share your closing statement, sir.
Yes, so first, thanks a lot for the invitation. So I thank a lot also Fashru Nofrian, who invited me personally, so a former PhD student in my university. So it's actually my second talk in Indonesia through Zoom. So last year I was invited by another former PhD student from a university in another location. So thanks a lot for the Indonesian people and Indonesian academics doing research. I appreciated a lot the comments, the discussion, and so on. And I would like to give a more, optimistic note. So we know that we're facing problems. So humanity is facing problems and so on, but we can do things to improve, and we can individually and also to our students and our research, we could try to improve the things and to be active and proactive. And I think that, just to give an example, indeed, it's not a solution. There's no single solution. There are many ways to tackle the issue of climate change. Central banks very recently have been pushed into this, but I can say at least for the intellectual production, so that in Europe, or in my central bank in my country, there have been a real big change. So it seems that doing PhDs or research on climate change and any type of, say, policy which could be done is expanded to be a very, I would say, hot topic in the next years. So, and I hope that so there's also technologies, there's also institutional change, world cooperation, and the like. So, but in any case, we have to do something, and let's be proactive and a little bit more optimistic. Then we can do something for the next generation.
Thank you so much, Professor. So there are lots of different points that already being discussed by our speakers, and it's quite a lot if I have to point them one by one. So perhaps allow me to just resume it that regarding the sustainability growth and development, and specifically in the rise of stagflation and climate risk problems, it's not only one problem for one country, but it's all the problems for all of the countries. So it's going to be nice if we could sit down together, discuss it together, and mostly focusing more on the solution, not its problem itself, not the problem itself. So hopefully, professors, today's session and the next 3-day seminars that gathering different representatives of academics from different countries can be one point of us to help and discuss this solution together. So we already sit down together here today from 4 different countries. So in the next 3 days, probably we can have more insight from another representative from different countries. So thank you so much for your attending our seminars today, Professor Jean, Professor Susan, and Professor Jomo. My apologies, our utmost gratitude first to you, all of the speakers, for the knowledge. And of course, my sincere apology if during our discussion and during the session, I might be pronouncing names and titles not really correct. So sorry on that. And thank you so much, of course, to all of the participants joining us here in auditorium. And with that, our main session today is already concluded. And I would like to transfer back our next part to our Master of Ceremony. Mr. Matthew, please.
Thank you. Okay, let's give a round of applause for Dr. Miguna, Dr. Ahmad, and all the professors. I'd like to say thank you to our moderator, Dr. Miguna, and Mr. Ahmad, and all of the professors. The next agenda, before we head to the closing, is going to be handing over of certificate to our speakers and moderator. Maybe we are going to take the certificate first. I kindly invite our Dean, Ms. Dr. Dian Wicaksi, to hand over the certificate to our moderator. Okay. Okay. So for the first certificate for the professors first, via Zoom. Okay.
Okay. Who's the first? Thank you so much, Professor Zhang, Professor Kruger, and Professor Jomo for the great presentation.
Yeah, please accept this certificate as a high appreciation for your time. Professor Jomo, please accept this certification and for the great material you give to us.
Terima kasih.
And for Professor Susan Skurder, Thank you so much for your time and your insightful presentation. Please accept the certificate, Professor.
Congratulations.
And for Professor Prasentiantoko. Oh,
Left
already left.
already.
Okay. Okay, next. For Professor John Bernard Satay, thank you so much for your insightful presentation, Prof. Please accept this certificate.
For the last certificate is going to be for our moderator, Dr. Miguna. So I kindly invite Dr. Dian Wicaksi for joining us at the front to give the certificate to Dr. Miguna. Let's give a round of applause for our moderator. Big thank you, big gratitude for Dr. Miguna, as our moderator at leading us at today's agenda. Okay, documentation first. Okay, in count of 3, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, let's give a round of applause one more time for Dr. Miguna and Dr. Dian Wicaksi. Okay. Thank you very much to our moderator who has led today's discussion. And also thank you very much to our speakers who has given us knowledge. May it will be useful in our daily life. Amen. We finally came to the end of today's agenda. Let us close today's webinar by reciting gratitude. Those are the agendas we have presented to you all this afternoon. We hope you learned something, and I would like to apologize from the deepest of my heart for my mistakes in presenting in this event. And don't forget to join us again tomorrow, the second day of JESICA 2022. Thank you very much for your kind attention. See you on the next day. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Stay safe and healthy, and salam bela negara. Thank you, everyone.